Hello and welcome to another exciting webinar from the Educator School Safety Network. I'm Amanda Klinger.
And I'm Dr. Amy Klinger.
We are a national nonprofit organization and we provide school safety training and resources and technical assistance. And one of the things that we do is professional development like this that is free, that is evidence-based, and that is web-based so that you can get good, solid information that can help your educational practice from the comfort of your own home, from the comfort of your desk in your classroom, maybe, I don't know, on your phone when you're waiting for your kids to be done at soccer practice, wherever the mood strikes. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started unless you have anything else you want to say before we jump in.
Nope.
Okay. So as I said, we are the Educator School Safety Network. We're a national nonprofit. We do this work throughout the United States and Canada. And in addition to being a nonprofit, the other thing that really makes us unique is that we come from an educational perspective. And the reason that we have such a strong educational perspective is because, Dr. Amy Klinger, you want to go ahead?
Well, hopefully you've watched our other webinars, so this is old news, so we apologize if it is. But I think it's always good to kind of review our background a little bit because we do come from a practitioner perspective. My background is as a public school administrator and teacher, 25 plus years in public schools as a building level principal, in addition to being a professor of educational administration at Ashland University in Ohio. So it's really important for us to have that education lens and to have that practitioner perspective, but it's also important to have some other interdisciplinary perspectives to bring to this work as well. And that takes us to Amanda's perspective.
Are you going to point? You should point down at, I'm below you, so you have to point down at me.
Like the Brady Bunch?
Yeah, I pointed up at you earlier.
Okay.
Well, I am an attorney by training, and I try to keep my obnoxious attorneyness to a dull roar most of the time. But actually today when we're talking about threat assessment, I will talk a little bit about the impact that doing good threat assessment, having a good threat assessment and management process can have on your school or your school district's potential exposure to liability. Spoiler alert, it's a really good thing about your exposure to liability. And that's one nice thing that I get to bring to this work is, I've worked in other areas of the law, and what's really nice about school safety, or what's really nice for me personally, is that school safety is one of the few areas where the thing that you want to do as an educator, as someone who cares about kids, the thing that you want to do from a moral and ethical standpoint is actually the thing that's going to help you from a legal standpoint, which unfortunately is not always the case in other areas of the law. So that part is actually really nice for us. So I talked about a little bit about the work that we do. We do a lot of media interviews. We do a lot of preparing resources and webinars and things like this. If you are interested, you've heard us kind of allude to some of the other work that we've done. You can always check out other live streams, other webinars that we have. If you're finding us on YouTube, you can see our YouTube channel. You can always head to our website, www.eschoolsafety.org. We have tons and tons of information. All of our podcasts are there. If there's something in this webinar that you hear us allude to in passing and you think, wait, what is that? They said it so quickly. We probably have talked about it at great length in some of our prior episodes, and so that would be a good place to start. And then if you're really struggling and can't figure something out, you can always reach out to us directly, either on social media or through our website, info@eschoolsafety.org. So, you ready to jump right into it?
Being the operative term, because we have the capability to talk at great length about all of these things. So yeah, there's lots of content out there. So we're going to try to make this particular webinar kind of an overview and sort of compact, giving you a little bit of a sampler in terms of what should you be doing and thinking about in terms of threat assessment. So here's what we're going to cover.
So we want to talk about kind of these three big questions. So what is threat assessment and management? You've probably heard it a lot in the media, but we do want to talk about what is it really? And there's a couple of specific evidence-based models that we want to talk about specifically. And then the next big question that we always hear is, how do we get started? My school or my district doesn't have a threat assessment and management team. How do we get started? How can we start to do this work? And then the third question, and I get asked this a lot, which is, can't we just buy a checklist? I had a company or an organization who said, oh, you don't need to do all that work. You don't need to have a team. You don't need to have a process. I'll just sell you a checklist and you can do that. And so we'll sort of talk about some of the concerns inherent
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, Spoiler alert, no, you really shouldn't. And we'll talk about some of the concerns or problems of that sort of a shortcut.
All right. So I think that in the wake of some of the tragedies that have happened in schools, that particularly in the wake of Parkland, you hear a lot of conversation, which we find to be very encouraging, about threat assessment, about prevention, not just response, and the whole notion of how do we identify individuals of concern and do something before these horrific acts occur. And so that really begs the question of engaging in threat assessment. And the female Department of Education says one of the most useful tools a school can develop is a multidisciplinary school threat assessment team. And so clearly there is the need for this. And also there is, unfortunately, beginning to be some misconceptions about what threat assessment actually is. So that's one of the aspects that we're going to talk about as well. Do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I know as an educator, you are not legally allowed to be critical of the Department of Education, but I can be, which is, you'll see the citation down here. It's from 2013, right? Is threat assessment that you heard about a lot in your practice as a professional educator since 2013? Probably not. And you'll notice this guidance, it's one of the most useful tools a school can develop. That guidance is hidden on page 62 of a document that is really important, but really dry reading about developing emergency operations plans. So this is not something that the Department of Education or FEMA really has been shouting from the rooftops up until
recently.
Up until very, very recently, this is something that we were talking to schools about, and this is a way to be proactive, and this is a way to work to prevent violence in your schools. And there was not a lot of support from on high, other than this sort of statement. So I am really glad to hear that that tide is turning. And so then the question is, how do we turn that tide in a way that we're implementing threat assessment with fidelity, not just we're implementing something and calling it threat assessment. So when we talk about threat assessment, there's a couple of really big evidence-based models. The big one that we like to talk about the most is the University of Virginia model. It was developed at the Curry School of Education by Dr. Dewey Cornell. It is sort of taking a law enforcement model of threat assessment, of does this person pose a risk or a threat for violence, and really translating it fully into an educational context. It is not taking a law enforcement system and just plunking it on top of a school. It is really taking the critical components and really translating it for a school and an educational audience. So that part's really great. And then the other part that's nice is that they have done a ton of research at UVA and other places about this model. It has been comprehensively studied over and over and over since 2001 and has been indicated in every instance to prevent violence. That is something that we can do to work to prevent violence in schools, and it actually works. One of those such studies that I want to point you to, there's a lot that show this works. We can work to prevent violence in school, but one that they did that was, I thought, really interesting was looking at students' perception. What impact this intervention, like we know interventions such as security cameras or metal detectors, we know interventions like that have a negative impact on students' perception of safety and on their perception of their school community. Here, when they're talking about threat assessment, in this study, students reported less bullying, a greater willingness to seek help, and more positive perceptions of school climate, and there were fewer long-term suspensions. And this is not the students that were being examined or contemplated in threat assessment. These are all the other kids. So these are unintended consequences. So unlike some of the other interventions that, if you've been listening to our webinars or our podcasts, you always hear us railing against, unlike these other interventions that have these really negative and problematic unintended consequence. The unintended consequence of threat assessment is students who didn't know threat assessment was happening said, this place feels safer. This place feels like there's less bullying. I feel like I can talk to adults more. And what else do we want as educators other than that we have all of these other positive climate and culture impacts because of the interventions that we undertake? So that's the one big system. The other one that we do want to talk about is Secret Service guidance. The Secret Service came out with, when was this? Oh, July of 2018. Some specific guidance about enhancing school safety using a threat assessment model. I do not think, and you can jump in here if you want, I don't think that anything in this is really incongruent with the University of Virginia model. I think there are some things that they have that are a little bit additional, a little bit different use of terms, but
I think there's a little bit more practicality to how this really looks in the implementation cycle in schools. I think it's a little more practical.
But there is nothing in the University of Virginia model or the Secret Service model that contradicts the other. So when
No.
we teach threat assessment in school districts and we're training up threat assessment teams, we use research and we use information from both. I think the resources from both can be used in tandem, and they don't need to be incongruent. The third one that people sometimes use, and actually it's really kind of localized to the Pacific Northwest, is the Salem-Kaiser model, which is again based in a lot of the same foundational principles of what can we do to provide supports and interventions to students who are at risk for violence against themselves or others. So we won't talk about that one today because we don't really tend to teach that one because there's so much good stuff in these two models which have a lot of evidence to support their efficacy. So I know you like to do this, what is and what is not. I think you should say, where does this teaching modality of what something is and what something is not, where does that come from? Where does that come to us from?
That comes to us from 7th grade language arts, where you teach vocabulary and you're struggling to get kids to understand definitions. So you talk about what something is and what something is not. And so when we talk about threat assessment management, this is a really crucial conversation because especially within the last couple of years, very often there is a misunderstanding, a conceptual misunderstanding of what threat assessment is, but also what it can't or should not be doing. So it's really important to see this is what it really is about, and this is what it's really for, and this is not what it's for. So we need to kind of set the foundation with that. So what threat assessment is and what it is not. And there's a couple really key elements: a fact-based investigative approach to determining how likely a person is to carry out a threat of violence. So let's go back and pull out a couple of those key words. Fact-based is one very crucial one. It's looking at facts, finding out through an investigation what we know to be true, not our bias, not our conditioned response, not our, well, you know, that's how that family is, and remember how the brother was, and all those kind of things. It's looking at what we know to be true based on facts using an investigation. And so those are really critical components of threat assessment. It is not a checklist of warning signs or red flags. And if you ever go back and look at some of the checklists that were used, you know, post Columbine in the early 2000s, they're really, I mean,
black fingernail polish.
Any of us could, on a given day, exhibit, you know, excessive rage or, you know, problems with authority, or, you know, all these different things that literally every 8th grade boy in the world would fit that profile depending on the day and the situation. So it is not just about how to bounce a kid from school. I'm going to fill out this form, I'm going to check these appropriate boxes, and he's gone. So that is not what this is about. It's about a fact-based investigative approach where we really are looking at all of the components. Then we have these 3 really significant verbs: identifying who should we be worried about, assessing how worried we should be about that individual, and then managing. What are we going to do about that? How are we going to manage this individual within the school environment? And those 3 verbs are really important: identify, assess, and manage. But equally important is the second half of this definition, who are at risk for violence against themselves or others. That it is not just about one particular type of violence. So in other words, it is not a means to label a student as a troublemaker or to use disciplinary consequences. That's not to say that we wouldn't be doing disciplinary consequences. We're not going to do threat assessment every time we, you know, have a disciplinary consequence for a kid running in the hall. So it is not, while that may occur, that is not the motivation behind threat assessment, is wanting to apply discipline. You want to go ahead and speak to
Yeah.
sort of the second part of this?
And this sort of builds off what you said, that it's for a student who might be at risk for violence against themselves or others. Threat assessment is a way to identify someone who has the potential for violence in many forms. So it's not just, here, next slide, not just a means to find the next school shooter. We're looking for folks who might be at risk for self-harm, dating violence, assault, risk-taking behavior, suicide, substance abuse, other aggressive or dangerous behaviors. We are not just looking for who's the next school shooter. And the uncomfortable part of this that we need to consider in our own school communities is, statistically speaking, you probably don't have a student who is likely to carry out or planning or really about to commit a school shooting. However, if you look at this list, you probably have a student who is about to or engaging in self-harm, assault, risk-taking behaviors, dating violence, substance abuse. You probably personally know a child, a student, that you are concerned about their risk for some of these things. And so that's when we talk about the broad application of threat assessment, we're working to prevent violence and tragedy in many, many, many forms, not just that one. So you talked about the three big verbs. So we have identify, assess, and manage individuals of concern. Do you want to speak to that a little bit more?
And you'll notice that this inverted pyramid is really important because we are going to identify or take a look at a significant number of people. And we'll talk about that in terms of the referral process. We are going to assess how concerned we should be at a smaller level, and then we are going to manage at a much smaller level, even than that. So we're not going to necessarily have a care plan for every kid that is referred to us. But when we identify individuals of concern, we're going to do that fact-based investigative approach as part of our assessment. And then we're going to construct care plans that may have varying degrees of depth and scope that are appropriate for those individuals we are concerned about, who have that potential for violence against themselves or others. So you can kind of see that this is all focused on these individuals of concern as we move through the process.
And when we do training like this, where we're training up teams at schools or districts, we'll always sort of caution people, don't be alarmed if we spend a lot of time, especially at the beginning, do a lot of that top triangle, identify, that we're doing a lot of identifying. That's okay. We are trying to come to a place, and we'll talk about this when we talk about how do we start this process. We need to have a lot of training for the people who are serving on the team. But you know what? Every other member of your school community and every person who collects a paycheck from your organization needs to have some understanding of what is this team and what are they trying to accomplish. And the reason that they need to know that is because they are going to help in the identification. And it's going to take a little bit of time to calibrate that. And so we want to be sure that we're really cognizant that we're not discouraging the person who works in the lunchroom. And they say, you know what, this kid is always doing this and writing stuff, and I always see him drawing stuff, and I'm really concerned about this student. We don't want to discourage that person from bringing that to our attention. And it might very well turn out that all of their drawings about tanks are because they have a really serious interest in the history of World War I era tanks, and they're not struggling in other areas of their life, and they're not being violent, and they're not posing a risk to themselves or others. It might just be this interest, and that's okay. And that's part of that initial identify and assess. And some of the research out of the University of Virginia will show that when they field tested this years and years ago in different high schools, that was what they found. They were doing a lot of identifying, they were doing a little bit less assessing, and that there were very few cases where students really needed intensive supports and interventions in that management phase. And so we need to make sure that we give ourselves permission to do that. And part of that is that the threat assessment process is not stigmatized. It's not that, oh, you're a bad kid if you went to threat assessment. This is part of the supports and interventions that we provide. This is part of the plethora of things that we do to support student success in our school. So what we're looking at, and I think a good way to frame this question, is the central question of balancing. That student has a right to a free and appropriate public education, and that might look a little different in an independent school or in a private school, but that student has some sort of a right to education. and everyone else has the right to remain there and to be safe. And so when you said earlier, this is not just a way to enact discipline consequences or remove a student from school. There will come a time where we might have to separate or remove a student from school because that student has a right to a free and appropriate public education, but it's not an absolute right. And everyone else has the right to remain safe at school, and that's not an absolute right. So that doesn't mean that we exclude the kid the first time that something small happens. It's really that balancing act. And I think in one of our previous live streams, we talked about zero tolerance and the problem that zero tolerance makes for us to be able to balance these two interests. And I think it's possible. We certainly see a lot of schools that do it well, that they are balancing the rights of the individuals and the rights of the collective. Do you want to add anything to that?
No.
Okay.
I just think that, as an administrator, that is one of the big questions that you're constantly struggling with, because when we have that scale there, you have parents pounding the table that are saying, you need to get rid of this kid. He's a threat to my kid. And they are pushing down the scale on the right of the school to be safe at the expense of the individual. And other times you have the individual or the parent of the individual that is saying, hey, my kid has the right to be here. You're unnecessarily targeting them, et cetera, et cetera. So that push-pull between those two sides of the scale is a very difficult thing to do as an administrator and as an educator, which makes it even more important to have systems in place like threat assessment that are formalized, that have specific policies and procedures that are not perceived as being arbitrary, that we're just going to do this one time, that have a process involved that is fair and equitable, that has a collection of individuals instead of one person making a very significant decision about a kid's educational progress. And so it's really that multifactored and that interdisciplinary element that really protects both sides of this coin that we're looking at.
Yeah. So we have the three big verbs: identify, assess, and manage. Let's talk about the first one, the identify. In this, we have these questions. What do we want people to tell us? When do we want people to refer? Who do we want to tell us things? And how do we want people to tell us? And those might seem like very simple questions. But, for example, the what do we want people to tell us? If someone a student says, I'm going to bring a knife to school, I'm going to bring a gun to school, clearly we want people to tell us that. But what if we have a student who just has become withdrawn and their grades are slipping and they don't sit with any friends at lunch anymore? They sit by themselves and they are isolated and they used to raise their hand in class and they don't anymore. Is that something that we want someone to tell us? I would posit yes, because if threat assessment is not a punitive or a stigmatized thing, if threat assessment is a way for us to say, we're concerned about this student, what supports and interventions might be appropriate? So yes, that is something we would want people to tell us. The question of when do we want people to refer? Obviously, the earlier someone is in their process of committing a violent act against themselves or others, the earlier we are in that process, the more supports and interventions we can provide and the more effective those supports and interventions will be. Do you want to talk about who we want to tell us things?
I think it's really important for us to make sure that we are looking at our potential sources of referral from a variety of different ways. Clearly, we're going to look at educators first, but they're probably, frankly, not the most valuable source of referrals. Oftentimes, the most valuable source of referrals are the peers, other kids in the school community, parents, other stakeholders outside of the classroom, whether they're bus drivers, coaches, local youth ministers, people that have associations with these individuals that are outside the formality of a typical classroom. We start with educators and we know that they're a great source of referrals, but please don't limit to just what the teachers can see. Instead, what we know that there's a variety of other folks that know things that we need to know. And then that begs the question of how are they going to tell us? And so there needs to be discussion about how we can formalize the referral process, but yet not exclude those individuals. So if we have a 12-page form, we're going to get very few referrals.
Right.
On the other hand, if we have no form and it's just, hey, I think you should look at so-and-so, we've not formalized the process very much, and we're not necessarily documenting and getting the information that we need to do an appropriate fact-based investigation. So somewhere between those 2 points, we need to have a process in place that is not overwhelming, that is not punitive, that is not, that has a low bar of entry in terms of people's willingness to say, this is what I've heard. But yet we also need to have the capability for documentation and being able to move them through the process. So that whole discussion of how people report, people get really hung up on, of like, what's the form look like? Are we
Mhm.
going to do this? Are we going to do that? But we really want to make sure that we have a mechanism for people to give us, to tell us what they know and what they're concerned about.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about getting referrals from other stakeholders, and I think that leads into the discussion of disclosures. Now, I know we've done other webinars where we're talking a lot about violence prevention, and I think disclosures we always talk about is one of the most important things, that we're creating a school climate and culture where students feel comfortable to tell us the things that they're concerned about. And getting disclosures from students is a huge part of a successful threat assessment and management program. What do you wanna talk about disclosures a little bit?
Well, oftentimes the disclosures may lead to a threat assessment referral process. So, a kid sees something concerning on social media, then we have that threshold or that moment of, who do I tell and how? Am I going to tell a teacher? Am I going to make report your anonymous tip line? Am I going to tell another kid what I saw? So those disclosures need to make their way very quickly and very efficiently to the right people. And if we have a relationship-based culture where a kid sees something on social media, they disclose it to a teacher, that can immediately then be reported as part of threat assessment, and we begin that fact-based investigation. So I think the obstacles to disclosure are the ones that really need to be examined.
Mm-hmm.
So I encourage you to go back and look at some of the things where we've talked about in the past, some of our webinars and podcasts where we talked about the obstacles to disclosure, because we cannot just say threat assessment is only predicated on what the teachers can see
Yeah.
and know about. It has to also be predicated on what peers and other kids are seeing and other stakeholders in the community, in the school community, are seeing.
Yep.
So the disclosures from all of them are really critical.
So we talked about disclosures. That's what all the information that we're getting. So that's the identify. So then the next part is assess. So someone, a student or a professional educator or a staff member, has said, I'm concerned about this individual because of this reason. That's not the end of the process. We don't just say, okay, well, then we'll probably bounce them out of school. Then we need to really assess and look at, what does it mean. So assessing, we're gathering information. Again, it's the fact-based investigative approach. It's not just, what do you think about this kid? What do you think about this kid? What do we know from their record? What do we know from facts? What do we know from things people have observed? But what do we know from things that we have as part of our institutional memory? So we gather information, we evaluate the information as a group, as a team. So it's not just your opinion of him. It's, well, I've observed this in my classroom. Okay, but I know this really works in my classroom, that we're doing it as part of a team. And then we come to some sort of a conclusion. And in assessment procedures, there's a number of different things that we would look at. We would conduct interviews. Why don't you talk a little bit about who would we interview?
Yeah, I want to hit on that because we automatically sort of default to some of the other things in terms of an investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, we're going to look at their record and see what they've done wrong in the past and those sort of things. But probably the most valuable aspects of the assessment and the investigation is conducting interviews where we're talking to people. We're talking to the peers, the witnesses to the event. We're talking to the teachers. We're talking most significantly probably to the individual themselves. We're talking to parents, and clearly those are going to be difficult conversations.
I'm going to
But
be a
it's so
stupid devil's
important.
advocate. Why would you talk to the student? Then they'll know. They'll know that we're doing threat assessment on them.
Right, which is what we want. We want students to understand that we are concerned about them, that we are here to support them. If we're doing it in a punitive sense, it's not a criminal investigation where we're building a case to go to the grand jury. It's where we're looking at a kid and going, what do we need? What appropriate supports and interventions can we provide? And so talking with the student, not to go, you know what, we're on to you. We know what you're doing, but talking with the student in terms of what's going on, what can we do to help? How are you feeling about this? And so having those conversations are really important. But keep in mind that even though we've used the word investigation, these are conversations that are very open-ended, where we're talking about trying to understand the context of what's happening. So if a particular incident comes to our attention, and that's why we're doing the threat assessment, then we want to be having interviews and conversations with people about that incident in terms of the context, what was exactly said, what was going on at the time, what were they doing, what was someone else doing, how did you feel about that? But we also want to have conversations that are investigative about what's going on with this person. What else is happening? Or what else are you concerned about? What's going on with so and so? Have you seen anything that's troubling to you? How are you feeling about this? These very open-ended conversations that will lead us to oftentimes other things that we were unaware were necessarily happening. The point of entry may have been the particular incident that led to the referral, but once we're into that investigation, and those conversations will lead us into a variety of different areas, either ruling out or taking us into other areas of concern that we need to be aware of, and other situations that we need to consider. So the interview piece is going to be really critical. But
Do you interview the
we
parents?
also have a variety of other data at our disposal.
Do you interview the parents?
And the interview idea sometimes really is a misnomer, because it's making it sound like we're going to bring them in, we're going to
Shine
shine
a
bright light on them, and we're going to interrogate them and force them to give up private information about their family. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about having conversations with parents and kids and peers and all these different folks, having conversations about what's going on, how are you feeling, what concerns do you have, what sort of supports and interventions do you need, what's happening in these particular situations, do you know anything about this, do you have any concerns about that? So interviews may not be necessarily always the right term. I think sort of open conversations, open-ended conversations might be a better term to consider in context with the interviews as well. So those people-centered things are really going to be critical. But our investigation also needs to incorporate other data points that we already have. Things in the permanent record, past incidents, different situations that have occurred, what's going on with them in terms of what supports and interventions are already in place, those sort of things. And then looking a little bit broader beyond the scope of the school in terms of, depending on the severity, what's in their locker, what access do they have, what's happening out in the community, what's going on in football practice, what's happening on their social media, all of these different components. Because again, we're trying to get a comprehensive view of what's happening with an individual, not just this is what they said or this is what I read on their social media, but all of the pieces that we're able to put together as part of that investigation.
So we talk about assessment, and then we'll get to the sort of this third piece, manage. So we've identified, and obviously we're going through, and maybe it's important to say, we're going through this really quickly. When we do training for this, when we train up teams, this is a full day training. And we talk about equally about what is threat assessment, what are we looking for, what are we trying to accomplish, how do we assess threats, what are the supports, interventions, and then we talk a lot about how will we make that work here, how will we implement that, how will that integrate in the things that we're already doing.
And it's obviously really important to look at both sides that you've described, not just the theory of conceptually what are we trying to do, but also the logistics of how does that work here.
As a school leader, as an educator. Yeah. And, so obviously this is a 1 hour webinar. So obviously there's a lot of stuff that we're omitting. And maybe that's probably important to make a note of. So when we talk about the manage portion, we're developing action or care plans. The team will decide on a course of action and then apply existing structures and supports. This is not a brand new thing. I think when we talk sometimes with educators who are concerned about threat assessment, well, I already do this. We already do PBIS and we do response to intervention and we have care teams and this and that and all these things. Threat assessment is not replacing any of those things. Threat assessment is a specific formalized way to incorporate a lot of the other things that we're already doing for this one specific type of concern. So
what we don't want to have is a situation where we have parallel play, where we have the threat assessment team over here doing their thing, and then we have RTI or PBIS or whatever alphabet soup you have of behavioral and social emotional learning over here doing their own thing, and the two never meet.
Yeah.
It's rather collaboration between those and being able to apply the structures of both of them in the interest of the kid.
Yeah. So when we talk about management plans, this is from the threat assessment guidance. They are sort of reminding us here that removing a student from the school does not eliminate the risk to a community. So obviously there are times where removal or suspension or exclusion is necessary and appropriate, but we cannot say, oh, we suspended that kid, therefore problem is solved. That is, what happened at Parkland. That student was removed and excluded from school. That did not eliminate the risk to the school community. So when we're talking,
and that's one of the big concerns that I have with threat assessment. As it becomes more prevalent and we're tossing this word around more and more, there is certainly the danger, and we've seen this happen in a variety of different schools, there is certainly the danger of threat assessment being perceived as a club by which we can beat a kid with and get them out of the school community, as opposed to a tool in the toolbox by which we can support kids and prevent violence within the context of their day-to-day educational process. So it's really important that we don't allow threat assessment to become bastardized to the point where it is a weapon, where we have weaponized it as opposed to a tool that we can use to support kids. And that is something we all need to be really vigilant about and really constantly be assessing. Are we doing this in a way that is going to provide appropriate supports and interventions, or are we using this as a way to get to an end that we have already predetermined we're trying to get to?
Yeah. So developing a course of action looking at strategies to reduce risk. That will be a conglomeration of discipline approaches, potentially law enforcement involvement, and that's something we discuss a lot when we do training for this for schools and teams, that law enforcement should not automatically be involved. If the concern that we have is about a student who is depressed and withdrawn and their anxiety is making them struggle in class, that's not a law enforcement issue. If we have a student who brings a gun, we are going to involve law enforcement, but we need to make sure that we are being really specific and intentional about our choice of whether we're involving law enforcement or not. And then we are implementing the policies and procedures that we have already in place and the specific intervention measures. And again, you sort of talked about this earlier, threat assessment is a standard system. So the way that we treat your student is the same way that we'll treat this student. And these are the things that we have at our disposal. And that doesn't mean everyone gets every intervention. That means this is the way that we do this. And we provide supports and interventions that are necessary and appropriate for the specific case with the student. We do have.
It's really important that we're putting together a patchwork of interventions and support as part of this management plan that incorporates the unique needs of that individual. Maybe there's going to be counseling, there's going to be school-based interventions, there's going to be mentorships, there's going to be daily check-ins, there's going to be academic support. So we're patchworking or Frankensteining, depending on which image you want to use, but we're putting together this network of really specific supports and interventions for that individual that is going to evolve. So after a certain amount of time, we may be swapping out one piece for another. We may be eliminating a certain piece. So there is not going to be a specific care plan that says, this is what we do to every kid who comes through threat assessment. This is what we're going to provide to every single kid. We're pre-selecting. And those of you in the special education world, any of us never looked at an IEP, with that same philosophy of putting together something that provides that speaks to the unique needs of that individual is exactly what we need to do in the management plan for threat assessment.
So we do have available for purchase on our website a tip sheet for supports and interventions that talks about more specific strategies for how to do this and how to incorporate some of the things that your school might already have at your disposal to do that. So that's sort of the what is threat assessment. Obviously, we went through a lot of content in a very short period of time.
The Reader's Digest version.
Yeah, that's like the tip of the iceberg.
Reader's Digest anymore.
But I do want to transition into the next question, which is how do we get started? So obviously, there's a lot more that if this is something that you're just dipping your toe into, obviously there's a lot more to learn. But the question is, how would we get started? One of the most important action steps to implement is to identify who should be on the team. when we have a multidisciplinary threat assessment team, who should be on it? It's not necessarily the same folks that are on the safety team. We're looking for specific skills and dispositions. We're looking for people who have a lot of positive who have skills to be able to have those interviews, those conversations with the student that we're concerned about, with the parents, with the peers. We're looking for people who have an analytical mindset, who understand this behavior that the student is engaging in is really typical of a seventh grader, or it's very atypical, and maybe we need to address that. Then the most important action step, I think, is appropriate training for team members, making sure that that the person who's conducting your training, you're focusing on it from an educational perspective. As I said earlier, threat assessment does come to us from the world of law enforcement, but it is not appropriate for a law enforcement FBI official to be, or a Secret Service official to be conducting this training, because we are looking at an educational model of behavioral threat assessment and management. You would consider that someone to be a member of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, someone who has comparable expertise, not just a law enforcement person who knows the term threat assessment and can do about it. And again, you want to make sure that any training that you have includes the theory, and we talked about this earlier, the theory of threat assessment, of what is it, what are we trying to accomplish, and then the practical logistical concerns for implementation in a school setting, in an educational setting. And that's really a critical part of the training.
Or you can just call us.
Well, yes, we do training like this, and we meet all those criteria. Do you want to talk about the next step of the policies and procedures?
Yeah, and I think it's important to have this be a formalized process. So we're going to have policies and procedures. It should not be something that we just kind of do and we sort of wing it. We need to determine how we're going to implement it, what kind of training we're going to have, how are we going to assess whether this process is working, how many referrals we've had, what the disposition of those referrals has been, all those different components. So it's really the idea of getting started is really to sort of look at how do we put together a team? Is it going to be at the district level or at the building level, depending on the size? And then putting together those appropriate members, getting them the training that they need, creating the policies and procedures that will formalize that, and then piloting it and getting started. But unfortunately, one of the reasons that people don't do threat assessment as much as they should is because it is a process. You can't just flip the switch and on Monday talk about it, and on Tuesday you got it up and running. It is a process that is incremental and that you need to take these steps to do. So but on the other hand, we really encourage folks, you have to take that first step. You have to get started. So I think it's really critical to get that moving. And once you put those things into place, to really formalize it. Typically, the board would adopt it as well, so that you have the support of your governing body that says, yes, this is something that we do. We have to communicate with parents about it as well. And then we also have to understand that there is a foundational level of training that everyone needs to have, whether they're on the actual team or not, so that everyone that collects a paycheck from the organization understands we have a threat assessment team, which maybe we're going to call something else, because threat assessment is kind of an awful name to actually use for the team. A care team, a crisis team, a support team, whatever you want to call it.
It's almost like you knew the next slide.
Needs to understand. I'm sorry?
It's almost like you knew the next slide.
Everybody needs to know what this team is and what it's for and what their role is, because everyone has a role to play in terms of making referrals, but also in terms of supporting the interventions that are going to be in place and assisting with those.
So this is just a side note. So
yeah, that's the little bit of the side note.
So this is a bit of a side note. So in case you're watching this and going, you know what, that work seems really important, I think that would be great, I would hate to do a thing and call it threats and say a student is a threat. And I think that's a really valid concern. Threat assessment, the process of behavioral threat assessment and management is a term of art. And so we're always going to continue to say that because, as I'm going to say in just a few seconds, there's a lot of confusion about what threat assessment is and what something else that we call threat assessment. So we're going to continue to use it as a term of art, but we do encourage schools that we work with to think of a name that is more appropriate for their school community. In the Secret Service guidance, they talk about possible names, crisis response team. I disagree with that one because hopefully you should be doing a lot of threat assessment where it's not yet a crisis. The one that I really like a lot, the assessment and care team, I think is a really good one, or behavioral intervention teams. I think a lot of schools are already doing things that you would call a behavioral intervention team.
Yeah.
But to think of something that we're sort of capturing, what does that look like here? The assessment and care team one, I think, is probably the best of those, but to think of what that might look like in your school. So then, kind of wrap up here, our last question, can't we just buy a checklist? I field a lot of calls from people at schools and school districts who want to buy a threat assessment checklist. And there are some documents that can support this work. There are documents that can help you have a conversation with parents or an individual of concern to make sure that you're going about that in a way that's helpful and supportive.
Guided questions, things like that.
Guided questions. There are documents and forms that will help you on the intake of why are we concerned about this kid? What did they say exactly? What were the circumstances? Who heard it? What do we? There are documents and forms and checklist type things that can help us in this process. But I think, as you sort of alluded to earlier, we have to be really, really careful that we are not cutting the corners on this, because we are trying to implement a system that is evidence-based, and we're trying to do it with fidelity. And when we cut too many corners, that balance of this student's right and the right to be safe comes out of whack. The feeling that parents have of, you're targeting my kid because you're just filling out a checklist, but I heard the other time you were interviewing these people and doing all these other things. So,
well, and I kind of equate that to where we see when we look at emergency operation plans for our schools, and we'll find a bunch of verbiage that was cut and pasted from another plan and just plunked down to the point where they forgot to change the name to their school's name. Yeah. And so when you look at that, you go, these people are not integrating the process. They're just going through the motions.
Yeah.
And when we're purchasing checklists and we're just plunking them in, we're just going through the motions, as opposed to really understanding the process and then making decisions and saying, okay, I like this question. I like this aspect of the form. This thing makes sense to me to implement. That's what we're hoping for, is that people first understand the process and then use those resources to help them to implement the process, not the other way around, where the resources dictate what you're doing.
Yeah. So we do talk a little bit about things that are called threat assessment in name only. And this has sort of happened in the last couple of years where the term threat assessment is being bandied about a lot more. And so people are doing things and calling it threat assessment. Some examples of things that are more like profiling, some of the past ways that some of these used to happen with guided professional judgment or automated decision making, things that were sort of taking actuarial formulas and trying to apply it to some of this. But any of these checklists, so I guess the general...
And a lot of the filters, the software filters, where if you use a certain term and then it aggregates it and determines that you're a threat because you used a particular term.
Yeah, and so as the concern, with all of these is that we are trying to implement a specific type of process. And there's just some corners that cannot be cut. Education is a people business. We are dealing with students and we are dealing with individuals, and we cannot distill some of this to data points, something that can be done by software. You talk about social media monitoring, and you kind of alluded to some of that. That is emotional labor. Threat assessment and management, providing supports and interventions to students that make sense, takes emotional, human labor. And there's just some of these corners that just cannot be cut. And then one last thing I did want to say, sometimes this is a way that the term is misused, the difference between a vulnerability assessment and a threat assessment. So we were talking today in this webinar about threat assessment. So we're talking about individuals who might be at risk for violence against themselves or others. The threat assessment team, you will meet as the need arises. Threat assessment teams typically will have scheduled standing meetings where they'll talk about the process and how it's going and that sort of thing. But if we have an individual who indicates that they're going to commit suicide after school today, the team needs to meet that day. We can't meet 2 weeks from Tuesday at our normally scheduled meeting. Contrast that with a vulnerability assessment. A vulnerability assessment is about stuff. You can schedule it. You should schedule one. We do a lot of vulnerability assessments for schools where we come in with a multidisciplinary team looking at the facility, looking at procedures, looking at policies. You are looking at stuff. And so sometimes the other way this gets confused is a threat assessment team and a safety team. So if you are concerned that your door doesn't lock and you're not sure where you're supposed to evacuate to, that's a concern. That's a vulnerability assessment concern for the safety team. That is not a threat assessment. If you have a student that you're concerned about because they're engaging in behaviors of concern, that's for the threat assessment team.
And that's really important because we see that misapplied all the time. So you have a school where somebody left the locker room door propped open and they say, hey, we need to do a threat assessment because that was a potential threat. No, it
Yeah.
wasn't. It was a vulnerability.
Mhm.
And then you have someone that says, hey, we had someone that wrote bomb on the bathroom wall. We need to do a threat assessment. No, you're not. You are looking at the validity and the plausibility of that particular threat. What you're doing is when you say, we have an individual who propped the door open and wrote bomb on the bathroom wall, now we're doing a threat assessment on that individual. So it's really important to understand that those other two things are not about an individual. They're about trying to do something with your facility or a procedure. They're about trying to evaluate an incident that occurred. But we're talking about looking at that individual that did a particular thing or said a particular thing.
So, if there's someone that you wish had seen this webinar, if you're watching this and you're going, man, I wish my principal or I wish a colleague of mine had seen this, you can always send them eschoolsafety.org/webinar, which is where this webinar and all of our other webinars live. Also, keep in mind we have a lot of ongoing online professional development. We have webinars like this one. We have live streams that we do about once a week, and then we have those live streams are also available for podcasts. So we have folks who like to join us live and participate, and we always wave to the people who are joining us live. But then we have folks who like to listen to it later on as a podcast when they're walking the dog or doing dishes or whatever the case may be. So we're trying to make high quality professional development that's accessible for people. And we're trying to really meet people where they are. Another way you
Did
can.
we mention it's free?
I don't know. Did we mention it's free?
Because it is.
It's free. Another way that we connect with people is we do have a newsletter. So instead of you having to come and subscribe to a podcast, if you invite us into your email inboxes, we will come once a month with a newsletter sort of breaking down new things, resources, what's happening. So you can pause this and you can scan that QR code if you have a QR code reader, or you can enter that super short URL. I think if you go to our website, you'll also be able to see it. Another resource we have is our book. We did write a book for ASCD that was published, and I think other than you get to hang out with us more, in the pages of a book, which is always exciting, we really tried to make it geared towards practitioners. So what we talk about in the book is based in evidence, but it is not a highfalutin academic thought experiment about school safety. There are practical tips for you as an educational professional. What are the things that I can do to work to keep students safe?
And we do talk about threat assessment at length.
In the book, yeah. So there's all of our contact information. You can reach us on email, on social media. There's the URL for the website with all of the other resources that we have. Do you have anything else you want to add?
Nope. The only thing I will say about threat assessment is what I always say about school safety. It's like eating an elephant. You just need to do it a bite at a time. So please don't be intimidated or overwhelmed. Just get started.
So there you have it. Thanks so much.